Thank you for joining me today, Adam. As we were kind of talking about before, free will is obviously a very important topic for both of us, and for a lot of people, as it's being questioned. And you had mentioned that you have thought about this for a while, and that's been an important topic. So I wonder, maybe before we go into the kind of, this amazing paper that you've written, which I will include in the link, the cybernetic Bayesian brain hypothesis. Um, I wonder, yeah, what was it like for you struggling with the question of free will? And you'd mentioned that it's your why really for doing this work. So I wondered if you could start there for people.
Mm. Well, it's really good to be talking to you. It's your overall. I'm still getting a sense for it, but your overall project is it's really inspiring to me, and it actually speaks to my deepest values. Yes, and in a way, my journey into science came from partially a place of curiosity and partially a place of terror or despair, even about basically, is meaning possible? There was even the book Why We Are the Way We Are, The New Science of Evolutionary Psychology. There was a single sentence that basically, I think it went, everything leading up to this moment, including your genes and your early environment, and the first half of the sentence will determine how you respond to the second half of the sentence. But it was this one thing, and I was like, oh. And I was in this frame where I couldn't find any meanings. And it's like, oh, wait, everything I'm doing, all my beliefs, my desires, these are not important. It's just like some illusion. I'm just fooled. And then I was thinking, well, yeah, actually, there isn't a single neuron in my head that knows or cares that I exist, is there? Their neurons are just going to neuron. It's like, oh, even more so, sodium ions are just going to sodium ion. And you keep going with that. It's like, oh, I see. I'm a nothing. It's not even I'm a nothing. It's just nothing is nothing. It was like, I didn't see how there could be any meaning. And I was in a pretty bad place with it for a while. And so I'm both eventually I came to a position of it seems we have the varieties of free will really worth wanting. And then the question is how and why. Not all of them. There's so much I think are quite worth wanting we just don't have. I would love to fly right now. I would love to be able to do
Yeah.
regeneration of my body, as it ages. That would be lovely. Not in my will. It would definitely be worth having, though. Totally worth it. But the idea is we have just enough of the degrees of freedom worth wanting that meaning is possible if we're skillful. Just enough. And so, the journey into cognitive science, two questions of artificial intelligence. What is a mind? Could we build one day? And also, can something like a mind be causal in a meaningful way? And what would that mean? And I've been on that path ever since, of trying to figure out how agency works, how purpose works, and trying to figure out ways in which we can have more of it.
And yeah, I kind of, because I was really struck in the paper by how, I suppose, meticulously you'd really, because a lot of people, for me, I suppose, start on the philosophical level. That's where we're kind of used to dealing with these questions of free will versus determinism. But it really, my impression was that you were going bottom up. I mean, you were starting from the fundamental kind of mechanics and working from there. Do you think that's a fair categorization of how you were going about it?
I mean, that's the goal. To be able to build up in a bottom up account. But I guess the process was, I don't know, maybe middle out or out in. I'm not sure, because it's so the goal is to trying to figure out how something like a brain could actually be a goal seeking system, that we could actually have this other this dual description of, or not just dual but multi description, not just dynamics and physics, but in an entailed set of meanings and or another level of information geometry, but something that basically another equally valid level of description where we find our purposes. And it's oh, yes, that is both how it works and how it feels. And with the thought being that basically, like folk understandings of like, you know, the common understandings, our shared intuitions about are probably actually quite wise. And that people's sense of themselves, like instead of dismissing and saying that, you know, no, now we know for real that that's just all an illusion, these are naive impressions. You know, not that we know we should just take, you know, what the majority says. We're not like voting on science or reality of like or how we work, but
Yeah.
people, they think about themselves and how they work, and we shouldn't just throw away lightly people's felt sense of what it is to be in the world, both in terms of their own meanings and also as a prior on what are plausible hypotheses. You know,
Mm.
and so the goal though would be basically a mechanistic account of how we work as goal-seeking systems, and a mechanistic account uh, that captures the adaptive significance of particular mechanisms and their why particular sub-mechanisms would have their functioning in an overall system that could give rise to something like agency. It's
Mm.
it's a big task, but that's the task that natural selection like laid out. And I'm not saying it's
Yeah.
completed, but like that's in a way natural selection, that was natural selection's task, was finding a mechanism that could like create a goal-seeking system that could that could reach complex targets, and then through its
Mhm.
actions bring these um, uh, system world configurations into being that lets the game keep going. And so natural selection had to figure this out. And so then the goal is saying, okay, well, what are the mechanisms of agency as the core problem of understanding intelligence, and probably the most important thing we can think of with respect to things like psychiatry too, like if the mechanisms of your agency are off, everything is off. It's, you know, the way you value and you choose, when that goes off, when that goes away from what we would wish, that's in a way the most important thing for why we'd even call it pathology. It's almost the very definition of it. It's like not
Yep.
being able to achieve goals and realize value. And so it's I know it's like I realize it's an insanely ambitious project, and so the
Mm.
method is just basically trying to you know, part of a community with doing massive cross referencing of different perspectives and trying to say, okay, what do you say on this? What do you say on this? Try to bring together as many perspectives as possible, and seeing
Yep.
where you have non-overlapping uh, places of knowledge where better knowledge in one domain can fill in another. And so using a little bit of the mechanistic to fill in, to say like how particular high level processes might be realized, but also keeping in mind like what we're looking for is something that will have the shape of the functioning of a valuing being moving through that's capable of moving through the world and adjusting its behavior to achieve the goals it needs as a precondition for its existence. So
Yeah, and I think it's a pressing need as well. It's something we spoke about before, which is that it's kind of ethically for, I suppose, in philosophy, there's been a big split for a long time in terms of the kind of physicalism versus idealism versus kind of the immateriality. You end up with this weird kind of dualism, and we've really struggled to give an account of human agency that can fit within a scientific paradigm. And I really think that that would help to unify, even because you have this split between, say, religion, which is not necessarily a system of propositions that describe reality, but is more, I think, a system for boosting something like agency intergenerationally. And then you have something like science, which is a description of the world as things. And so there's a gap between our forum for action, to use, I don't know if you've read Peterson's Maps of Meaning, but he talks about this forum for action versus, you know, the world as categorized objects. And that gap has existential consequences for yourself, for me, for a lot of people. And I think we're also building it into our technology a lot. The AI question obviously is the litmus test for that. Like, can consciousness come out of a physical machine of putting things together? And I think there's a really pressing, like, this is the time to try and bring that all together, it seems.
agree completely and deeply. So I've read Maps of Meaning twice. I should remember, but that distinction between like the form for action and then the symbolic understanding. Could you say a little bit more on that? So you're saying that
Sorry,
distinction.
you kind of broke up. You broke up there for a second, Adam. It just I couldn't hear it.
So, maps of meaning. I've read it. It's a tremendous work, and
And it reminded me of your work as well. Like there was something, not that it was coming from the same place, but it was converging, I thought.
Well, there is actually overlap. Around the time I was writing that, I was working with Colin DeYoung also, who's a student of Jordan. So actually, I think there's probably cross seeding. But you made this distinction, and maybe it's like a Heideggerian one of like the world of inaction versus the symbolic world. Was that and then like the distance between them?
Yeah, well, I guess they're modes of description in the sense that I was using them, that we can describe the world as a form for action, which is what mythology and narrative does, as a world of goals and valued objects and things that we pursue, or the scientific world, which categorizes things as not for action, trying to remove subjectivity from them, almost remove the valuing processes in order to kind of just sift out the what will be objective characteristics.
It's like Galileo's error type project of specifically trying to arrive at this view from nowhere as a goal.
Yes.
And
exactly.
Set it up but by setting it up that way, well, there's a value to getting this like view invariant like descriptions. When you then try to use that to handle our meanings, careful. You've set up the game from the beginning where you wouldn't be able to find them because of the very method you were using. It's like, yeah,
it's impossible.
Yeah.
And we're trapped in that view from nowhere, I think, in a sense of it becomes a lot of people are now kind of, they're unable to see through the form for action lens. We have even like the free will debate, because if there is no free will, there's no moral responsibility. If there's no moral responsibility, there's no meaning. We lose ethics, we lose a lot of tradition. And so there's these fundamental split between a lot of the moral traditions that would have made sense of our lives and that aspect of the scientific paradigm. And so I think there needs to be some sort of bridge between them, which is what I think Peterson was trying to do in Maps of Meaning, in a sense of showing how we're actually the type of things that are goal directed, that are adaptive, that are focused on successful action and from an evolutionary perspective. I don't know if that's landing, but that seems to be key to the project.
No, it's landing.
Okay, good.
It's the other way that I've heard that sometimes described as like bridging like the manifest and scientific image in some like this, the world as it appears to us, and then the scientific description, and then that difference. And actually, I think I encountered that through Dennett, and it's interesting how much he inspired so much of it. But in a way, he's like, in my thinking, he's become like one of the greatest like champions of meaning and one of the greatest obstacles to it. It's this like like for instance, like the insights, like that very extended existential crisis about free will. It was Freedom Evolves, like learning about compatibilism and the way in which like you can have like, you could have a deterministic description that's then on another level. It's the way you could perfectly well talk about it causally would be in terms of beliefs and desires, and they do not need to come into conflict. In fact, causation doesn't even do that in terms of like, to the degree that we've worked out mode like where we actually know what we're talking about when we say the word cause, when we're actually not technically engaging in something like Frankfurtian BS. Like if you actually know if you actually try to pin down cause stays in its lanes. It doesn't cross levels of description and then negate them. Like like Pearlian causation doesn't do that. And there's other like custom causal contrastive causation. It might like favor one versus another. Like, where do you get the biggest difference in terms of like these paired states of the world? Or Eric Hol's version of causation, where it's like you're flexibly course grading a system, saying like, okay, I'm going to kind of look at it in different ways until I find like the patterning that gives me like the most economical description of it. And you can see how that's even a natural kind for nature in terms of like like the system like coordinating with itself, self-organizing. That the most elegant description in terms of like its attracting structure could be in some ways the most relevant one. It could be like in terms of the determination, what will determine the evolution of a system. Like what are the patterns worth tracking? Those might actually be the patterns for the system itself that are important. And so it's and so we talk about like cause as if we know what we're talking about, but then when we try to pin it down, turns out that it turns out it actually isn't an enemy of your freedom, that there's this other causal description, because a proper understanding of causation in terms of a precise one, it's just another level of analysis. It's just a way. It's a bookkeeping scheme for trying to track patterns and explain and predict. But people are conflating causation with like a primitive of nature, saying it's like a conservation law or something like this. And it's like, no, it's a fairly elaborate set of conceptual moves we're doing when we're doing that. But it's just kind of taken as a simple given. And then, like you were saying earlier, like Sapolsky, like in his book, like he just comes in like, yeah, come on. It's like, what do you mean, come on? What are we actually talking about here? So Dennett, I thought, like for me, he was very one of his great contributions to these debates is just like he really, I thought, clearly expressed the compatibilist message in terms of like the risk of category error, trying to explain things at the wrong level of analysis, and you're actually literally meaningless in what you're saying. You're actually like you're switching meanings mid-sentence. It's so that's like so that philosophical defense of free will has always been like important to me. But for this paper, what I was trying to do is basically go into saying, okay, let's actually try to trace out the mechanics as a kind of like architecture, as a machine learning architecture even, and like trace you out as a mechanism, saying, okay, well, what is it that's doing action selection, and what is it that's doing like planning in real world environments, and what is it that like, and let's go back to what is it that actually the cascade that will result in an impulse at your muscle spindle that eventually moves you. So let's start keeping track of these details and try to describe them. It's a big lift, but let's try.
It's the biggest lift. That's why I was shocked that I saw somebody doing it, to be honest, because it's an incredible move, and I think it's 100% the way to do it. I mean, it really is. It's so difficult. That's why nobody's done it, I think. But that question of, because you mentioned the action selection. I mean, I don't know if I got this correctly, but I think it's analogous. This type of development, you'd mentioned, it's analogous to Vygotsky's internalization of speech in thought. And so if I've got this correctly, I mean, on the level of voluntary action, that's kind of an evolution from the inhibition of behavior that we develop. The inhibition of motor control routines that creates a kind of mental simulation. I know that's a very crude version, but
no, I mean, it actually might even, we have no idea about this, but it could even be potentially a source of especially strong selection in hominids like us, in terms of the mechanism of this inhibition. Like there could even be like, there's a pathway of the I think left inferior frontal cortex, the hyperdirect pathway of the basal ganglia, where actually cortex can intervene in a way that can produce a very powerful stop signal. And if this could basically allow you to basically run your action selection machinery in a decoupled mode, in an imaginative mode more effectively, and you would need actually kind of, for it to work, as you expand imaginative capacity, you would also need to strengthen the inhibitory capacity. Otherwise, the organism will get into trouble. So, because a furiously daydreaming organism can be great as long as it doesn't act out on every daydream.
Doesn't do it.
Yeah, so you would need both that inhibition in addition to like increasing like the gain on your imaginative capacity. And this might actually be that combination, selection around there, like preconditions for things like the great leap forward in cognitive evolution, or like 70, 80,000 years, whenever it happened, like that made us a fully symbolic species. Probably it was a combination of this enhanced like ability to do counterfactuals, but also to support the counterfactuals, you need to have greater self-control abilities of those varieties, and the inhibition of the motor output would have been particularly important. But in this account also, though, in terms of advanced agency, the idea is so the Vygotskian internalization. So it's like for Vygotsky, first you learn to speak externally for like communicative ends, but then you co-opt the process through its partial expression. You then start to use this to structure your thought and use it as a thinking tool. And the idea then would be that that shape is basically all executive control. It's the same thing of like, for instance, the way I would move my attention around. If I were to want to like move my spatial attention, I would basically, I begin to recruit the motor pools. Could even, if you add that stop signal and even get purchase over it. But so you'll get the efference copies, basically have a kind of prediction of like this area of space via history of associations should now be primed. But now your eyes are forward, but you're moving your attention. And then now you have purchase over things like the flow of your working memory. There's a kind of strange loop issue here. It's like, regulators of regulators of regulators, but still, if the whole system can couple with basically an agent architecture and an agent architecture that is reason responsive, and capable of supporting high level meanings, well, now we're getting a lot of the agency we want from here. But yeah, so that's a lot of detail there. Then where we should focus, but yeah.
But it's building. I mean, I'm trying to track as much as I can in terms of this, because I wonder, there's a weird, it's not a segue, it's meant to be on the same topic, but because you did the paper with Colin on the cybernetics, I mean,
Yeah.
do you think conscientiousness is tracking that ability? Because I've heard conscientiousness described as, the ability to inhibit distraction to pursue counterfactual goals, basically. And also people with ADHD who would have, say, is basically a deficiency of agency. I mean, you don't have the task as much ability to focus on specific tasks at one time. Are low people that are low in conscientiousness, basically. I wonder, do you think that is kind of tracking that ability?
It seems that way, and there's such an interesting thread in the etymology even. And so it's like kind of like I was saying earlier, like, I don't like disparage the folk ever. And I even in like sometimes where it seems like there's like a confusion, it's oftentimes wise. So like, it's like, wait, are we talking about consciousness or conscience or this? Oh, wait, you're taking etymology seriously? Yeah, I'm taking etymology seriously. And yeah. And so in this case, the ability to, so let's say you have a system capable of thinking of these, robustly generating counterfactual states. But what you want is for these counterfactuals to be part of an overall coherently functioning goal hierarchy in terms of there's things that are more and less important. They're being adjudicated among in the right circumstances. We have a lot of objectives, and we want to be able to commensurate among their different value in different circumstances and try to have a kind of common currency of value guiding us and their relative contributions in any given moment. And this would be something like wisdom and wise action or health. If that gets disrupted, you now have psychopathology almost definitionally. And that's Colin's view of psychopathology is like, you are not set up in your policies for your inaction, your characteristic adaptation, such that you can actually realize your values. And it's a process of like reconfiguring and retraining to give you policies that will allow you to achieve your goals. And this is the same as the maps of meaning framework, in that, for instance, you're in one domain, it's not enough to handle the task in front of you. Chaos enters and reigns for a time, and you now have to level up in some way. You have to go venture out into the new, update yourself, become different, a kind of rebirth even, to actually be better fit for purpose to handle what's a new world to you, but the world, you being new for this new world you're entering and making. And so, so Colin's framework, heavily inspired by that work from Jordan. And conscientiousness, he tends to think of it as the ability to adjudicate among these different goals and to have a coherently functioning goal hierarchy, like you said. And if you though have also though an enhanced imaginative capacity, in some ways that could be beneficial if you leverage it right, or you could be stimulus bound. You could be like, for instance, like thing, like Ulysses and like the sirens sort of thing. It's like you need to be able to like the thing in front of you. Now you're thinking about it, and if you're thinking about it and it's too strong, you might find yourself hyperbolically discounting future utility by chasing after that short-term goal. But you need to act. But the same imaginative capacity, if well harnessed, can help you see something different. I think in his case, he one way of doing it, you could just like like in the marshmallow test, you like one strategy is like you move the Oreo away from you don't even look at it. But he did something a little bit different. Like he just strapped himself to a mast.
Just tied himself, yeah.
His eyes open. And another one would be basically you somehow have the ability to you've honed your imagining so that you imagine the right things in the right time, and you can generate passions that are strong enough to overcome the other passions that come with the imaginings. I think Spinoza said something like only you need a greater passion to become a lesser passion. And so you need to be able to imagine the complex contingency of you being an extended meaning-making being, and you need to like imagine that vividly enough that it has a chance against more like stimulus, near-term supported things. Like here's the cookie in front of you now versus the goal for later.
Yep.
And so conscientiousness seems to really capture this integrated functioning. And so Colin has this one paper looking at the neural correlates of it. And it seems to be, if I'm recalling, it's like a combination of the salience network and the frontal parietal control network. And it seems to be like loading on both of them. And it's, Colin would actually, he'd be happy to talk and he would have really interesting things to say about that. But it's interesting that not all animals, is there something where you'd think of it like conscientiousness? It's like a latecomer per person.
There's not that many animal models as far as I was aware. It's quite,
So like you're saying, like in order to handle like this ability, like to potentially the imaginative capacity to it could help you to stitch together a coherent goal hierarchy that's temporally extended. In fact, you would need it for that, but it could also you could also go off the path. And so this,
and that it's longitudinal in a way, because that's something that struck me about this kind of the counterfactual imagining, or even like in predictive processing, like the deep temporal models, that this agency tends to be organization across time in a way. It's not like, I know the Libet experiment, which there's obviously a lot of criticisms of that, but that type of agency doesn't necessarily, I don't think that's necessarily the fundamental agency. Like this, the longitudinal, the ability to imagine counterfactual situations, entrain motor control processes to hit a target that's exceedingly unlikely, but necessary, seems to be more where agency, like that's what it is in a way. And the conscientiousness reference to conscience, I think, is very interesting. If you think of conscience as this developed inner authority from experiences of other inner authorities that you aggregate together to take a perspective on your own perspective. It's like part of our self-transcendence. And so I wonder, is that the beginning of like a biological argument for conscience? Or does that land, or does that,
I think so.
Or is it nuts?
But, and also in terms of like the connection to consciousness, I guess if like, what does it take to have a conscience? Like it requires a very robust imaginative capacity to view yourself and others and basically play things out in a wide range of situations, including novel configurations, because the future is not yet known. And so basically you're doing a kind of tree search into the future that's hopefully like wisely guided in terms of like different possible worlds that you and others could be in. And then you're trying to steer yourself into the right configuration. But this is requiring you being able to imagine others as you and you as them, and all sorts of different, you never step into this same stream of experience twice, and like what, and then we're doing this, and then you think that I think, and you think that. That's part of like the wisdom that you would need to have something like a conscience. How is what I'm going to do going to impact others, and vice versa? And so this should require this. It seems like being able to enhance imaginative capacity and also control it, to enhance it and control it, that would be like a key thing. And so basically, even you would expect some selection on the basic mechanisms that would give rise even to subjective experience at all. Potentially something like, I wouldn't say necessarily, I don't think we know that like humans, for instance, have greater consciousness level. but there might be unique selection on our capacity for consciousness, even in just experience itself, like the intensity with which we can, and the complexity of our percepts could be potentially different for this task.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And well, it does seem to be the kind of defining human, as you mentioned, that conscientiousness doesn't have that many animal models, that it affords us this organization across time. And I wonder, does it connect to your idea of embodied self models? And maybe with the selectivity thing, I mean, conscientiousness is the second best predictor of success. And obviously success is a proxy for, you know, reproductive. If you're socially successful, you're more likely to reproduce. So I guess it's not unrealistic to think conscientious people would be selected for reproductively. But how does it connect to the embodied self model? Sorry, I kind of slipped that in there, but
No, I think it does in a few ways. So like the idea of embodied self models, like we're basically trying to bootstrap a mind off of an initially, where the task in an ongoing fashion, but especially early on, is coordinating a body as it interacts with the world, as like the main task of a brain is to help a body get along through the world, and then finding more and more elaborate strategies of doing this. But starting out for the infant, you got to crawl before you walk, before you run, before you fly, right? And so literally we're figuring out crawling and things like this. And this isn't new. A neo, you call it like a neo-Piagetian perspective. People have been saying that for a while. You got to but the claim I'm making, I guess, is that and I think people like George Lakoff would be very copacetic with his way of viewing things, is that you basically, because there is this learning curriculum, it seems, it's bootstrapped off of the body, and where the body is the constant controlling the body in an ongoing fashion is still one of the, you got to keep on top of that. That basically the dominant organizing principle for minds has to always be linked back to basically this embodied interaction with the world, and that you're constantly complexifying that and leveraging that and building up layers on top of that. And so an embodied self model, the idea is we have at different levels of abstraction these represent these models, sometimes explicit representations, sometimes implicit though, of what our body is doing as it engages with the world. And this is the primary kind of currency of the mind. And so in terms of things like conscientiousness, so for instance, like self-control. So one idea would be that actually the executive functions, you could recast them as actually so people sometimes use the language of having like an optimal grip on things as like a general metaphor of control. And so from this like radically embodied perspective, the idea is by grips, they're actually grips. It's actually, there is something about the early experience of hand-eye coordination as a central task. And then later, in this kind of Vygotskian sense, we redeploy it. We are actually grasping things in mind. We are taking abstract concepts, somaticizing them. And so basically, with respect to something like conscientiousness, the ability to have self-control would be, in a way, a kind of would be connected to things like willpower, and it would be connected to things like general purpose systems and kind of hub structures within networks of an architecture that you could potentially like overuse too, where there might be like willpower is a limited resource, and part of this and the phenomenology of it and even the mechanism could come back to basically its embodied origins. It's this, the ability to stay on top of things, and even the feeling of it, and the mechanism of nuancing your interaction with the world where you are in control, where you have the right grip, would have, the claim is there's overlap with the very self-same networks that are used in gripping, and that actually the developmental origin is actually building up complexity on a cybernetic control system for this embodied agent, that basically you then have self-control in different circumstances. It is actually a very somatic thing, and for me it feels that way. I guess there's one other thing, which is in terms of the complex, so this idea of like an embodied self model, there's different kinds of them. And one idea is, okay, so what about moving from, and especially getting, I think, to your work, how do we get to meaning? Moving from like a purely first person kind of first person shooter agent that works from an egocentric perspective to an
Yep.
allocentric representation on the self, the objectification of the self as based in another format where I'm seeing myself from without.
Mm-hmm.
And so then the idea is basically something and this would allow for basically a greater invariance and a flexibility of moving between you and other agents, and you can build up more complex structures you could visualize and then map onto linguistic systems. If I can objectify myself, I can talk about myself not just from describing what it is like to be the first person narrator of my life, but also as others would see me and as I would see them. So how do you get to that? And so the idea there is one way you could bootstrap an embodied self model that would support something like an objectifiable allocentric view in the self would be through things like mirroring with others, and watching others as they do things, and then imagining you as them and them as you, or scaffolding these mirror relations through like play between parents and children. And that basically, if you now have association between your own inaction and your own sense of what your body is doing, and now the percepts that would be seeing someone else do them, you then build up auto-associative linkages. So now I can move between my own first-person agency and the control of my body like this, and imaginings of world states that could correspond to that viewed from other perspectives. And so then this, I think, would play into conscientiousness. Like you would need basically there might be different kinds of embodied self models. And this other kind might be particularly important for basically supporting high-level extended meanings, things like narrative meanings, and that I now can talk about myself as you would talk about me, and I could talk about you as I would in all these different counterfactual scenarios. And now we can really coordinate across time, do what we need to basically try to be okay together as we sail through the world,
And that, I mean, it kind of comes in, it was reminding me a lot of, Peterson makes an argument in a TED talk on potential, where he talks about how we build up our representations of the world through embodied play, through imitation, mimetic. You give the child a fork and they look at it and it's this kind of random thing. And then you say, no, this is for food. Fork is a tool for that. And we learn from the bottom up in that way what things are, and we make these functional categories of them which reduce their complexity into something that we can actually deal with, and that is kind of expanding our domain of competence. Peterson's argument was that that's maturity, in a sense, if that's how we become a mature organism. But the problem with that is that it traps us then in the world of order, this quite functional categorical world that becomes very so we become overly specialized in a sense for it. And his argument is that meaning is at the edge of that world. I mean, he looks at meaning as the border between order and chaos. So it's that expanding, that it's almost like the improving of conscientiousness, or the testing of conscientiousness in the face of uncertainty, is where the meaning is coming from, in a sense, in like iterative games or bigger, I suppose, arenas, as we kind of face the unknown.
And then we're back to Vygotsky, like the idea of like a zone of proximal development, this place you need to be to become flow. And it's like basically, where can I learn? Where can I basically have enough grip? Where can I have enough grip that actually I can train my grip and refine it? But not so much of a grip that I don't have to train it. Basically challenge my grip a little bit. And then that being basically the place you need to be to grow. And basically, what a thing that a peak experience might also be the place you need to be for long-term health, potentially.
Yes, and that we're somehow set up for that, in a sense, is Peterson's argument, that because that experience of flow is an optimal subjective experience, it's something that we seek out. And it's also something that is mimicked by a lot of intoxicants, a lot of things that are substitutes essentially for flow. Like the social media technology is set up pretty much to engage a flow state, to encourage normative dissociation, to keep you using it in an infinite scroll. But then there's this, so I suppose that the flow can become disconnected from the zone of proximal development in a sense. But it's all, do you think that that's, so in that sense we're optimized for meaning, for that pursuit of developmental meaning that's good for us, but obviously it can become,
We're set up for that in like an environment that's closer to the environments of evolutionary adaptation, whether we're talking about genetic or cultural evolution. But
yeah.
there was basically it seems that correspondence, that I guess you say inductive bias, or like meta or heuristic, or that, but that correspondence between the organism, it makes sense. It ought to play, you would expect good optimization processes to sculpt us, to place us where we need to be to optimize ourselves. And so you would expect basically us to be attracted to these states of us being where we need to be okay in the long term, which will include growth and not getting,
Mm-hmm.
and will include, where can we, expand our realm of agency, of influence and meaning. And so,
Mm-hmm.
but then, but that correspondence and like the calibration of it arose under different conditions, and in the modern context, in a very shifting fitness landscape, they can get decoupled. And so then your work basically with the consequences of technology, it's like you're taking this core value signal that you ought to be attracted to for basically a meaningful life, a healthy, meaningful, and now you've co-opted it. And now you basically can satisfy that by other means, and you're grabbing that and basically putting you in addictive cycles, rather than you achieve the very opposite often. False flow. Yeah.
False flow, yeah. And you think that that's kind of a, because I suppose it is then the development of
Real
agency,
flow, but real
yeah,
flow,
like a
like,
normative constraint
yeah,
for
yeah.
these type of things.
Good flow. I don't know. Yeah.
Counterfeit flow, yeah, flow. Yeah, it's kind of like the question of transferability, isn't it? And like virtual reality, if you're just in virtual reality and it just optimizes you for this kind of illusory world and doesn't translate to the rest of your life, you're becoming overly fitted to a very a situation that's not going to benefit you overall. I suppose it's a disconnection between our fitness in reality and in digital. But yeah, do you think so? The development of this imaginative capacity for agency, being central to being a functioning human being. I mean, do you take it in the sense of a person's well-being? Have you thought about it in that kind of normative sense, I wonder?
So I've been thinking, I guess, so one would be like, what kind of the fundamentals of like the idea of eudaimonia, of like flourishing as over a lifetime, as being in touch with some good demon, or some good, like something like a conscience, but some like
Yeah.
process that can take into account long distance dependencies and context, and the context at a range that you would need for your life to go well as a whole with others. Because you're not going to get through this on your own, probably. You could try to make a break for it. I don't know how far you'll get. And so, but for that to be like governing, like it's sort of like, it's like Socrates is like, I always listen to my daemon. So there's like for those meanings to be vivid enough, that's an imaginative act, that creative act, to have, there's like a vivid imagination, to be, that you could be enslaved by logos benevolently, that you could be in touch with a principle like that, for the principle to actually have purchase on your soul, to be able to generate sufficient passions that it can vie with the other passions in the economy of your mind. And then, but then,
That's so, yeah. The one thing there, which is that the interesting thing is like that might be the destination of agency, because this idea of like thoughts determined by truth, actions determined by the good, perceptions determined by the beautiful. It's like you don't want just this kind of decadent free will to do whatever the hell you want, but perhaps the freedom to choose between the good and the lower, the freedom to be enslaved to the highest good, basically, as the kind of end result of it.
And to imagine it in being, to manifest it in your mind enough that it actually can have that it can shape what follows against what would be more like immediate contingencies. I guess the one, yeah.
And that there's, because we're talking ethically a lot, but I mean, because I am a philosopher, I suppose. So the hypothesis in a lot of the Neoplatonic philosophy was that that was reality, in a sense, that the good beyond all of the goods was the ultimate reality that we were coming to. And it's such a weird, I don't know, in their argument was by turning vision back on yourself, often through the eyes of another, you could get to the bottom of your own being, which was being in general. And that's kind of an imaginative social capturing of reality. Predictive processing, I think, has a little bit of this because it calls into question the naive realism of just immediately accessing objects as reality, and kind of casts a question of like, what's the reality then beyond that? And how do we access it? And in the Neoplatonic tradition, it was a mystical ascent. It was the way out of the cave. I mean, our perceptions and material world was us in the cave, and we had to undergo this process of self-transcendence, whereby we saw a little bit. We let in the light beyond our knowledge structures, and we gained a little bit each time until we had that experience. And maybe I'm grasping at straws here, but I wonder, does that appeal to you anyway? Is that somehow connected?
It's there's a sense of like predictive processing, like as you're trying to predict deeper into the future, you end up having to become more and more inclusive of factors and perspectives, and you're going to find yourself like more and more, to achieve anything of complexity over longer scales, coordinating with others. And so there's a sense in which, like, just to even successfully be able to predict yourself to do in a coherent way, and to be able to you coherently realizing something like a good in the future, the deeper you go, the more other including you have to be, in all likelihood. And so there is a sense in which it's going to require you to move into this intersubjective space where it's both taking on your views and others, because you're just not going to get very far otherwise. Hopefully, in a well-structured society, you should not be able to go deep very far with that.
Yep, become a tyrant.
Yeah, you might try to make a break for it, but ideally we have it set up where, as people think into their futures, they have to think about others, and they have to basically change their models to be other including, to be in this, in a way, a kind of self-transcendence coming in to self it all. You must transcend the self and include others if you want to self like you mean it, and in a complex world in an extended way, unless you somehow pulled off the tyrant thing. Hopefully not.
Yeah, and that seems so fundamental to democracy in a way, to, I suppose, bring it to where we're at, which is that's like the bet of distributed cognition, that somehow we can get a better optimal grip as the through line of what's happening from all of this multiplicity. We can't, through that kind of pursuit of the truth with others, we have a better chance of being adaptive to the changing. And an ideology that's just top down, authoritative, stultifies and becomes unfitted to the changing environment.
It's amazing the way the same principles across scales, whether we're talking like the society of your mind or the society of minds, it's beautiful even. The same kind of principles of harmony, in a way, keep getting as within, so without. It's
the hypothesis of Plato's Republic as well. I mean, where he takes the example of the unity of the soul is the same as unity in the Polis, and scales it up. And I think that's something we're very much missing now, because we, like, so much of the complexity is really about this self-knowledge. Like, what your work has shown is this fascinating account of bottom up to that imaginative level that I haven't seen before in any kind of scientific work. And so I kind of, I'm interested in trying to extrapolate from it, or what you see, what would you like to see come from that work socially, I suppose?
The hope would be, I guess, fourfold. One is to, if there is a place where we are in the fortunate position that our scientific understanding also helps our meanings, that seems like a good place to focus. It doesn't have to be the case. It could be the case that, science turns everything into a desert landscape. It's a bullet I'm fully willing to bite. But if it just so happens to be the case that a good mechanistic understanding doesn't harm our meanings, but could potentially deepen them and like giving us greater purchase on being able to follow through on them, then that's very motivating to me. If and pragmatically, if for things like wellness, whether it's trying to help people not go into illness or in more positive like expansion of capacity, and more self-actualization, basically if a better understanding of the micromechanics of your agency. So there's these debates in the willpower literature, like what does it mean? So being able to speak to those debates and actually help people practically, how can I better agent? And how can we help people better agent, both in best practices of like how you structure your life and maybe medical and technological interventions. And then eventually something like strong artificial intelligence or artificial general intelligence. Eventually, it seems we're going to need to create benevolent agents. And so if we're going to be trying to create benevolent agents, the micromechanics of agency and agency like ours might be very useful there. I don't know where we are right now with respect to moving on that. In some ways, it's like there's enough details there. Like, I don't know, how close are we to be able to make this engineering? I don't know. But it seems like knowledge is accumulating that eventually this will be an engineering project. Maybe surprisingly soon. I don't. I'm actually personally looking into that and talking to different people, and I just don't know what's possible right now in this world in terms of like what projects are and aren't possible. But eventually, also helping our meanings by helping to create beings that can help us out in ways that we're having trouble helping ourselves out. Things like let's say autonomous machines for like elder care, like helping with elder care. Things like ways where like we can maybe like reach higher on Maslow's pyramid or boat if like we could shore up some of the base a little bit more, and maybe even as ends in themselves one day. But that's a whole nother thing.
Yeah, I mean, that is definitely where this seems, because it is, I think so many of the problems with social media as the first public facing wave of AI has just been because of our lack of understanding of ourselves, of our agency, and even the people that are creating the technologies being, because I don't know about, I mean, Mark Zuckerberg, I don't know if he knows fully what it is that maybe he's ignoring the evidence, but I think we are creating such influential technologies over people, literally in the recesses of their mind, their development, that are filtering the information, curating the public conversation, that we need the right principles. And if your hypothesis is right, we might be capable of understanding the principles that we work on. And I think the optimal principles, the ethics, would be the golden shadow of those principles. They would be, if we can figure out how we work, then it also tells us in a sense how we work optimally and suboptimally.
And then what we want to try to live into, the parts of ourselves that are currently denied that we want to try to realize with our action. That's the hope.
It's a significant mission, no doubt, Adam. And yeah, I appreciate you so much making time for this conversation and for your work, because it's fascinating. And where can people find more of what you're doing? Where should they go if they're interested in learning more?
I put my papers up on Google Scholar, and I recently set up a website where people could contact me. And I'm going to start describing some of the upcoming activities, including a special issue of Royal Society on the topic of world models and consciousness and the intelligence of life, and probably soon an implied AI company for elder care. So,
well, that's another one. The population collapse. We didn't get into that, but save that for next time. Thank you again, Adam.
thank you so much.